In the shadowed annals of Hollywood, where friendships are fleeting and rivalries burn bright, there was one man Randolph Scott was said to despise. His own story, however, begins far from those Klieg lights. On January 23, 1898, in the rolling hills of Orange County, Virginia, he was raised in the heart of a sprawling, genteel Southern family, a world where the pillars of discipline, education, and integrity were not just taught, but etched into the soul. These were the very traits that would later cast the long shadow of his screen presence and define the bedrock of his private character, inherited from his father, George Grant Scott. His father was a formidable and respected textile executive, while his mother, Lucille Crane Scott, embodied a quiet grace and Southern gentility. Randolph, the second of 7 children, grew up in the structured world of Charlotte, North Carolina, an upbringing that cultivated a deep well of quiet confidence. It was there that the moral uprightness, the unshakable core of his future film persona, was first forged, beginning in the halls of private schools. Later, at the Georgia Institute of Technology and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a different future was being mapped out for him. The plan was a respectable one, to follow his father's path into the world of business or engineering. But destiny, it seems, had authored a different script. Scott's ascent to the silver screen was not a sudden burst of light. It was a slow, deliberate climb, forged in the crucible of World War I, where he served with distinction as an artillery officer in France. He came home to a world changed, and a man transformed, carrying with him a new, profound sense of purpose into the early 1920s while on a visit to California. There, he fell under the spell of the burgeoning film industry, a city of dreams being built frame by flickering frame, and with his tall, athletic silhouette, his chiseled features, and an undeniable Southern charm, he began to draw the gaze of the casting directors who were the gatekeepers of that kingdom. His journey began in the dust and shadows of the backlots, working as an extra, a face in the crowd, a stuntman taking falls before he was ever given a line to speak. His early days were a testament to a quiet perseverance and a profound humility, qualities that set him apart in a town built on ego and ambition. By the close of the 1920s, he had secured his place in Hollywood, and as silent films gave way to sound, his deep, resonant voice emerged, giving him a presence that was impossible to ignore. Through the 1930s and 1940s, Randolph Scott's star ascended, his career flourishing across a landscape of different genres. He moved from comedy to drama with an easy grace, but it was in the sun-scorched expanse of the Western that his legend was truly born, with films like 1936's The Last of the Mohicans, with 1941's Western Union, and 1943's The Desperados. Scott became the living embodiment of the quintessential Western hero. He was stoic, honorable, a man of few words but unwavering conviction, unyielding in the face of a lawless world, his characters reflecting a moral code rooted in decency and courage. This was no act, it was a mirror to the man himself, who, unlike so many of his contemporaries, navigated the treacherous currents of celebrity without succumbing to its excesses. He was a figure of quiet professionalism, a man whose steadfast dedication to the craft became his own legend on the studio lots. The 1950s brought a collaboration with director Bud Boetticher, a partnership that would result in some of the most revered westerns ever committed to film, including 1956's 7 Men from Now. Classics like 1959's Ride Lonesome and 1960's Comanche Station followed, each a masterwork of the genre. In these films, Scott was portrayed as more than a hero. He was a man of action, haunted by the ghosts of his past, yet forever guided by an unbreakable moral compass. Scott's long shadow stretched far beyond his final, poignant performance in the 1962 classic Ride the High Country. Under the direction of a young Sam Peckinpah, he played an aging lawman, a relic of a bygone era, fighting to uphold his principles in a world that was rapidly leaving them behind. It was a role that perfectly mirrored his own graceful departure from the world of Hollywood, for when he retired, he did so at the very zenith of his dignity. He chose to leave the screen not when the roles dried up, but on his own terms, investing his earnings with a quiet wisdom in real estate and business ventures. In time, he would become one of the wealthiest actors of his generation, yet for all his financial success, he remained a man of profound modesty. He remained grounded, his focus always returning to his family and his faith. Randolph Scott would marry twice in his life, two unions that held their own stories, their own quiet dramas, unveiled two distinct sides of the man himself. One, a figure at home in the highest echelons of society. The other, a soul seeking the quiet solace of domestic life. His first foray into matrimony was in 1936, a union with the heiress Marion Dupont, a woman whose very name echoed with the weight of immense prestige. Within the gilded corridors of American industry and society, Marion stood as the daughter of William Dupont, Sr., a scion of the powerful and influential Dupont dynasty. She was, in fact, the great-granddaughter of Eleuthère Irénée Dupont de Nemours, the French-born chemist and visionary who founded E.I. Dupont de Nemours and Company, a corporate titan that would become one of the most formidable industrial empires in the annals of American history. Through this union, Randolph Scott was ushered into a rarefied world of inherited wealth, a realm of old money privilege. It was a universe away from his humble beginnings in North Carolina, and Marion Dupont was, in her own right, a figure of fascination and accomplishment. She was far more than a mere heiress. She was an independent, strong-willed equestrian, her life's passion devoted to the noble arts of horse breeding and racing. She was the mistress of Montpelier, the historic Virginia estate once home to President James Madison, which she meticulously transformed into a world-class sanctuary for breeding and training thoroughbreds. Yet, before her life intertwined with Scott's, Marion had been married to George Somerville, Virginia sportsman, and in a curious twist of fate, Randolph Scott himself had stood as the best man at their wedding, a peculiar connection, indeed. This detail casts an unusual shadow over their later romance, suggesting a bond that blossomed slowly, perhaps unexpectedly, from the quiet soil of friendship. But for all the glamour that enveloped their union, the marriage between Randolph Scott and Marion Dupont was not written in the stars. Their worlds, though both steeped in privilege, were fundamentally at odds. Scott, then an ascendant Hollywood star, was consumed with forging his career under the California sun, while Marion remained deeply rooted in her equestrian passions and the hallowed social traditions of the East Coast. The couple found themselves living separate lives, divided by more than just a continent, but by their very purpose. In 1939, a mere 3 years after they exchanged vows, their marriage was officially dissolved. While the union bore no children, the separation was, by all accounts, an amicable one. And yet, a curious postscript remained. Marion continued to carry the name Marion Dupont Scott for the remainder of her days, holding on to his surname for nearly 5 decades, until her passing in 1983. It was an enduring choice, one that speaks, perhaps, of a lingering fondness, a quiet respect that transcended their brief marriage. Or was it simply a desire to preserve the name that had come to define her own public identity? Within the exclusive circles of horse racing and philanthropy, after several years alone, Randolph Scott would finally discover a more enduring happiness. In 1944, he entered into his second marriage, wedding Patricia Stillman, a lovely young actress fully 21 years his junior. Patricia had graced the silver screen briefly in the early 1940s, but after her marriage to Scott, she gracefully retreated from the spotlight, dedicating herself to a life of family. Their relationship was a world apart from Scott's first, more socially calculated union with Marion Dupont. This marriage, it seemed, was built not on prestige, but on a foundation of genuine affection and shared principles. The couple settled into a quiet, comfortable, and lasting domesticity, deliberately shunning the glare of the Hollywood spotlight that so often consumed the celebrity unions of that era. In 1950, Randolph and Patricia grew their family, adopting 2 children, a daughter, Sandra, and a son, Christopher. Scott, the man who had carved his screen persona from the granite of the rugged, stoic Western hero, was, by every account, a devoted and gentle father. Friends and colleagues would often speak of the genuine warmth that radiated from his home and the profound bond he shared with his wife and children, a quiet sanctuary, unlike the turbulent lives of so many of his contemporaries. In a town built on fleeting passions and public collapses, Scott constructed a marriage that stood as a quiet fortress, untouched by scandal or the relentless glare of the spotlight. It was the foundation of his later contentment, a union with Patricia that would endure for 4 decades, ending only with his passing in 1987. Theirs was one of Hollywood's most private triumphs, a success story written far from the frantic energy of the film industry. The Scotts curated a life of deep serenity, moving between the manicured elegance of their Beverly Hills home and the wide-open soul of their ranch near Santa Barbara. It was there, in the vastness of the countryside, that Randolph could truly connect with his lifelong reverence for horses and the untamed land. Through this unwavering partnership, Scott finally found the profound stability and inner peace that had eluded him in his first marriage. He had built a tranquil domestic world that, in its own way, mirrored the strong, dependable heroes he so masterfully portrayed on the silver screen. In the vast landscape of the Hollywood Western, few figures cast a shadow as long as Randolph Scott and John Wayne both were towering monuments to rugged masculinity. Each man embodied a different code of heroism on screen, yet behind the curtain of cinema, their real-life relationship was a barren and hostile territory. While fans naturally assumed a kinship between two such titans, the truth was a far more intricate and cold affair. Randolph Scott, the very picture of the refined Southern gentleman, with his quiet dignity and flawless manners, harbored a deep and immutable dislike for John Wayne. Their chasm was wider than mere professional rivalry. It was carved from fundamental differences in personality, in values, and in how each man perceived the very art of acting, and the sacred code of the cowboy. "I never cared for the man," Scott once stated, with the blunt force of a final judgment. "He represented everything in Hollywood I didn't admire." Scott had built his entire persona, both on and off the screen, on the principle of restraint. His performances were deliberate, measured, radiating a quiet power that had no need for swagger or shouting to prove its strength. John Wayne, on the other hand, was the very embodiment of bravado, a boisterous and theatrical force. He was loud, commanding attention in any space he entered. "Wayne was a showman," Scott remarked, "and I was a craftsman. There's a difference." To Scott, Wayne's version of heroism felt exaggerated, almost theatrical, a myth spun by the Hollywood machine. It was a stark departure from the disciplined, authentic storytelling that Scott held in such high esteem. Behind the polished image of the Duke, Scott saw what he called a salesman's version of the West, an enterprise more concerned with image than with integrity. Their professional paths would occasionally cross, though they were never pitted against each other in a direct on-screen rivalry. Even so, the undercurrent of competition was undeniable, as both men were the premier leading men in Westerns throughout the 1940s and 1950s. And the studios, ever watchful of the box office, frequently compared their commercial draw. "The studios tried to pit us against each other," Scott recalled. "But the truth is, we never needed to be compared. We were playing two different games." Scott's films often explored a moral subtlety, a landscape of internal struggle and deep reflection, while Wayne's pictures thrived on grand spectacle and unwavering patriotic zeal. Scott considered that approach to be hollow. "I played men who questioned their choices," he said. Wayne played men who never questioned anything. Beyond these artistic disagreements, their very personalities were set in opposition. Scott was renowned for his calm, his gentlemanly demeanor, a man who rarely raised his voice or boasted of his own achievements. Wayne, conversely, was vociferous and politically outspoken, often dominating conversations with his unwavering conservative ideology and a bombastic self-assurance. "He liked to talk politics and war," Scott once remarked, a simple statement that illuminated the vast, unbridgeable divide between them. There were two things, Scott believed, that should never be glorified, neither in a dusty saloon nor on a sprawling soundstage. One was bravado, the other was Wayne's unwavering, self-assured patriotism. This worldview, so often painted in the stark moral terms of black and white, struck a discordant note deep within Scott, who believed that life, much like the frontier, was a landscape defined by its infinite gray areas. Their opposing temperaments were a volatile mix, ensuring that any meeting between them was destined to end in a heavy, charged silence or an exchange of remarks that cut deeper than any blade. Then there were the personal wounds, the subtle slights that carved the canyon between them ever wider. On several occasions, Scott reportedly felt the sharp sting of disrespect. It came disguised in Wayne's offhand comments about his acting style. Wayne, a man legendary for his bluntness, once carelessly referred to Scott as too pretty to play a real cowboy. It was an insult Scott never forgot, a symbol of what he saw as Wayne's flawed equation, that being loud somehow made a man authentic. I thought being real meant being quiet, Scott would later reflect. Even within Hollywood's intimate circles, an unspoken rule emerged. Scott would politely and quietly exit a party the moment John Wayne arrived. Their mutual acquaintances, icons like Gary Cooper and Joel McCrea, were often caught in the crossfire, walking a fine line between two titans. They learned to be careful, never to praise one man in front of the other. Yet, perhaps the deepest, most tangled root of Scott's dislike grew from what he perceived as a profound hypocrisy. Wayne, despite his celluloid image as a fearless American hero, had avoided military service during the Second World War. This was a decision that many in Hollywood quietly questioned. For Scott, who supported the war effort in other ways and held a lifelong reverence for soldiers, he saw this not as a choice, but as a moral failure. "I didn't judge men who stayed home," Scott later clarified, "but I couldn't stomach those who pretended to fight wars on screen after refusing to serve in one." To Randolph Scott, that single contradiction defined the very character of John Wayne. He was a man more concerned with the appearance of principle than the practice of it. Despite this deep-seated dislike, Scott never launched public attacks or sought to tarnish Wayne's legacy. His disdain was a private affair, revealed only in the candor of interviews late in his life. "I respected his success," Scott admitted once, "but I never respected the man." The two legends of the West remained professional, their paths rarely crossing after the 1950s. Yet, their silent feud became a whispered piece of Hollywood folklore. For all their differences, both men shaped the Western genre in ways that echo to this day. Scott, through his quiet dignity and moral complexity. Wayne, through his larger-than-life, uncomplicated heroism. Ironically, it was their very contrast that may have kept the genre itself in perfect dynamic balance. Still, in the heart of Randolph Scott, there was no affection, no camaraderie. There was only a deep and abiding dislike. "John Wayne," he once said with a cold, quiet finality, "was the last man I'd ride the range with." Randolph Scott passed away from heart and lung ailments in 1987, at the age of 89, in Beverly Hills, California. He was interred at Elmwood Cemetery in Charlotte. Back in North Carolina, a world away from the Hollywood lights, he and his wife, Patricia, had been married for 43 years. She died in 2004 and is now buried beside her husband. Their mid-century modern home, a relic of a bygone era, was torn down in 2008. But the Randolph Scott papers a trove of photos, scrapbooks, notes, letters, articles, and house plans were left to the UCLA Library Special Collections, preserving the quiet truth of a complicated man.